All right, so today we're going to be diving into some pretty deep philosophical waters, tackling John Dewey, and specifically his political philosophy. And, no worries if you haven't, read every single thing that Dewey ever wrote, because, believe me, it's a lot. But we've got a great guide for this deep dive. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Dewey's political philosophy. So think of this as, Dewey for philosophers, maybe a little bit of a refresher course for anybody who's been out of the Dewey game for a little while. Yep. But first things first, right? Who was this guy? I mean, we hear Dewey, we think education reform, we think pragmatism, but was he just some kind of armchair theorist, sitting in his office just thinking about these big ideas, or what's the story here?
No, not at all. Dewey's life is almost as fascinating as his ideas. I mean, this was a man who participated in Trotsky's trial, for goodness sake. He was deeply involved in social causes throughout his life.
See, that's what grabs me about Dewey, is that you have this philosopher who's actually putting his ideas into action, in the messy real world. He's not just theorizing about justice. No. He's out there, fighting for it on the ground.
Exactly, and that active engagement really gets to the heart of his philosophy, especially his rejection of absolutism.
Okay, absolutism now. For those of us who haven't, cracked open a Dewey book in a while, can you break that down for us? What do we mean by absolutism?
So Dewey was really pushing back against this idea of fixed eternal truths, particularly in social and political thought. He thought searching for those was kind of a distraction from the real work of solving actual problems.
So instead of debating some abstract notion of the good, Dewey's saying, hey, let's figure out how to actually make things better right here, right now.
Exactly. He was all about understanding the context, the history of a problem before trying to solve it. You see this in his critique of other philosophers who offered these grand pronouncements about society, but didn't really offer any practical solutions.
It's like they were writing from some ivory tower while Dewey's down in the trenches getting his hands dirty.
That's a great analogy. And that's where his experimentalism comes in.
Okay.
This idea that our beliefs are kind of tools for navigating the world, not representations of some ultimate truth.
So instead of clinging to these rigid ideologies, we should be constantly, testing our ideas, seeing what works, what doesn't, and adapting along the way. Kind of like a scientist in a lab, but for social and ethical problems.
Precisely. Dewey saw science as kind of a model for how we should approach all areas of life. He even went so far as to call values hypotheses.
Interesting.
They can be tested and revised based on experience.
That's a pretty radical idea, right? It means that even our most cherished values aren't set in stone.
It does challenge traditional ways of thinking about morality, but for Dewey, it was about making philosophy relevant to the complexities of modern life.
Which makes sense when you consider how much the world was changing in his lifetime, right? I mean, he was living through wars, technological advancements, social upheavals, clinging to some kind of rigid truth just wouldn't have been very helpful.
Yeah, and that brings us to one of Dewey's central concerns: the relationship between the individual and society.
Okay.
He was critical of classic liberalism, which often views the individual as this kind of self-sufficient atom.
Yeah, that rugged individualist ideal, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all that. Dewey wasn't buying it.
He saw it as kind of a simplistic view that ignored the ways that social conditions shape and limit individual freedom. He argued that true freedom wasn't just about being left alone, but about having the opportunity to grow and develop your capabilities.
So instead of focusing on just protecting individuals from government interference, we also need to create the conditions for them to actually flourish.
Exactly, and that requires a different understanding of freedom itself, one that Dewey called freedom as growth.
Okay, I like that.
It's not just about having choices, it's about having the capacity to make intelligent choices.
So it's not enough to just have a bunch of options if you don't have the education or the resources or the support to actually pursue them.
That's a great way to put it. Dewey believed that true freedom requires supportive social conditions, things like quality education, a robust democracy, economic security.
And there's that word democracy. And I know Dewey had some pretty radical ideas about what democracy really meant.
He did. It wasn't just about voting or institutions for him. It was a way of life.
I'm intrigued. What did Dewey mean by democracy as a way of life? Guess we'll have to unpack that in our next segment. And we're back, still trying to wrap our heads around John Dewey's idea of democracy as a way of life. It sounds pretty profound, I gotta say, but what does it actually mean? Isn't democracy just about elections and voting?
Well, yeah, I mean, for Dewey, those were just kind of the mechanics. He was much more interested in the spirit of democracy, this idea that it should permeate all aspects of our lives, from how we interact with each other to how we solve problems.
So even if we have like a perfectly functioning government on paper, we're not truly democratic if our workplaces are like hierarchical and stifling, or if we can't even have a civil conversation with someone who disagrees with us.
Exactly. Dewey believed that democracy was about fostering a certain quality of social relationships, commitment to open communication and collaborative problem solving. It's an ongoing experiment constantly evolving.
I'm starting to see how this ties back to his idea of experimentalism. It's like democracy is the system that allows us to kind of test our ideas about how to live together,
Yeah.
to see what works, what doesn't, and adapt accordingly.
That's a great connection. It highlights Dewey's belief that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, critical thinking, a willingness to engage with different perspectives.
It's not enough to just vote every few years or complain about politics on social media. We have to be actively involved in shaping our communities.
Precisely. And this brings us to another key concept in Dewey's political philosophy. The public. He argued that the line between public and private wasn't fixed, but rather it's determined by the extent to which our actions have consequences for others.
So something like pollution from a factory,
Hmm.
that wouldn't just be a private matter between the factory owner and their employees, but a public concern because it affects the health of the whole community.
Exactly. And Dewey believed that we need to apply democratic principles to address these public concerns through open dialogue, collaborative problem solving, and a willingness to experiment and find solutions.
It's fascinating how relevant these ideas feel to the problems we face today.
Mm.
He was writing in the early 20th century, but he was already grappling with issues like the influence of mass media, the rise of propaganda.
He was very concerned about how those forces could manipulate public opinion and undermine democracy. He saw education as the key to counteracting these threats.
Right. Education was huge for Dewey, and not just like rote learning, but a much richer, more holistic view of education.
Absolutely. For Dewey, education was about cultivating not just knowledge and skills, but also habits of critical thinking, open-mindedness, and collaboration. He wanted schools to be laboratories for democracy, places where students learn to think for themselves, work together, and solve problems collectively.
Which is a far cry from the kind of rigid hierarchical education system that was common in his time and sadly still exists in many places today.
Dewey was a champion of progressive education. He believed that education should be tailored to the needs and interests of individual students, foster creativity, and prepare them to be active, engaged citizens.
It sounds like Dewey's vision of education was really about empowering individuals to participate fully in a democratic society.
That's a great way to sum it up, and it highlights the interconnectedness of Dewey's ideas. His emphasis on individual growth, his commitment to democracy, his belief in the power of education, they all fit together into a coherent vision of a just and flourishing society.
It's a pretty inspiring vision, but I imagine there are also challenges to putting these ideas into practice.
Of course, Dewey was not naive about the difficulties of democracy, especially in a world facing so many complex problems. But he believed that his philosophy offered a framework for addressing those problems, a way of thinking and acting that could help us create a better world.
So it's not just a theoretical exercise, it's a call to action.
Exactly. Dewey believed that we all have a responsibility to participate in the democratic experiment, to contribute to the ongoing process of creating a more just and equitable society.
I think we're starting to get a sense of the depth and scope of Dewey's thought. But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we really hammer home some of the key takeaways from his political philosophy. We'll be right back after a quick break to synthesize some of these Deweyan insights and explore what they mean for us today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot with John Dewey, from his life to his ideas about democracy, education, the public. But before we wrap up, I kind of want to try to connect the dots here a little bit. It seems like there's a real coherence to his thought, like a kind of overarching project that he's working on. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Dewey's philosophy is more than just a collection of interesting ideas. It's a comprehensive worldview, a way of understanding and responding to the complexities of modern life.
And what did you say is like the central thread that ties it all together?
I think it's his commitment to experimentalism. This idea that we should approach all areas of life, ethics, politics, education, even art, with a spirit of open inquiry, a willingness to experiment and a commitment to learning from our mistakes.
So instead of clinging to these fixed truths or ideologies, We should be constantly testing our beliefs, seeing what works,
Yeah.
adapting to new situations.
Exactly. And that's why Dewey saw democracy as so important.
Yeah.
He believed that a democratic society was the best way to kind of foster this experimentalism on a social scale.
Because it allows for that free exchange of ideas,
Yeah.
right? For different perspectives to clash, for experimentation and adaptation to happen out there in the public sphere.
Precisely. Dewey thought that democracy wasn't just a form of government. It was kind of the social embodiment of experimentalism. It created the conditions for individual growth, social intelligence,
Yeah.
and that collective problem solving that was so central to his philosophy.
And that's where education comes in, right? It's not just about acquiring a knowledge, but about cultivating those habits of mind, those democratic virtues that are essential for a flourishing society.
Absolutely. Dewey saw education as the process of creating engaged, informed, critically thinking citizens who could participate fully in that democratic experiment.
So it's this beautiful cycle then, right? Democracy fosters education,
Yeah.
which in turn strengthens democracy, which creates the conditions for individual growth and social progress.
Exactly. And, this cycle is essential, especially when we consider that Dewey wasn't naive about the challenges of democracy. I mean, he was writing during a time of great upheaval, wars, revolutions, the rise of totalitarian ideologies.
He knew that democracy was fragile, that it required constant vigilance and effort to maintain. It wasn't something to just be taken for granted.
Yeah, and that's one of the most important lessons I think we can take from Dewey today. We're facing our own set of challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate change, economic inequality, political polarization. And we need his spirit of experimentalism, his commitment to democracy, his belief in the power of education more than ever.
It's a call to action, isn't it? A reminder that we all have a responsibility to participate in this ongoing experiment we call democracy, to work towards creating a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely, and that's the beauty of Dewey's philosophy. It's not just a theoretical exercise. It's a guide for living, for acting, for making a difference in the world.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking Dewey's political philosophy today. We've explored his life, his key ideas, and, even connected his thought to some of the most pressing issues of our time. I want to thank you, our expert guide, for sharing your insights and helping us navigate this complex world of John Dewey.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey. Remember, as Dewey himself reminds us, philosophy is not a spectator sport. It's a call to action. So go out there, experiment, collaborate, and be the change you want to see in the world. Until next time, keep diving deep.